فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So today I want to recap, and this is something I always love doing after a season, after a class, just to reflect and think back on what did I learn, what can I do moving forward. And today I want to reflect on the top 5 podcasts of 2025. So it's pretty crazy. I started this podcast in the beginning of the summer. I wanted to do something in the summer productive, and in the summertime as a professor, you're not really teaching. So podcasting has been a great way to continue the educational experience and to engage in entrepreneurship and reaching out to people in digital humanities and communication. So it's been around 6 months. So 6 months, we've done around 25 podcasts, 25 different episodes. Some have been me speaking about the Islamic Mary from the Quran. Others have been me focusing and reflecting on my experiences traveling and speaking on the topic. And others have been interviews that I've conducted with scholars and leaders in the field, thinking about issues around the Islamic Mary, whether that be on the Quran, interreligious studies, Christian-Muslim relations, and Islam and women. So today I want to go and reflect on the top 5 podcasts of 2025. So this podcast has now garnered almost 1,000 downloads. So thanks so much for all your support, listening and sharing this. And I want to go through and reflect on those 5 episodes that have received the most downloads. So the first one is why I am starting this podcast. So the very first episode was the one that's received the most downloads. And it started with me talking about my interest in this topic of the Islamic Mary, biblical and Quranic figures. So this is where I spoke about my name. So growing up here in the United States, people didn't really know the name Yunus. They didn't know how to pronounce it. I talk about the story of my football coach who was like, Jonas, always called me Jonas. And finally I told him, hey coach, my name is Yunus. And he said, oh, don't worry, Jonas, I'll get it right. So I gave up after that. So always trying to say your name. People are always asking, how do you pronounce it? How do you spell that? And then eventually letting some people know, hey, my name is Yunus, which means Jonah. And then people immediately recognizing that name, knowing how to spell it, knowing the story behind it. Oh, that's the guy in the whale, and so forth. So growing up with that name always made me conscious of the Quran, prophetic figures in the Quran, also how the Quran connects with the Bible. And I mentioned also in that podcast how my family had this really fascinating connection to names. So I grew up here in the United States, was born here in Indiana, lived most of my life on the East Coast in Northern Virginia. But my dad is originally from Pakistan. And in Pakistan, he grew up in a family. He was the youngest of several siblings, and his oldest was named Ismail. His second was named Ibrahim or Abraham. His third brother and sibling was named Ishaq or Isaac. And then he was eventually born and he's named Yaqub or Jacob. So when my family was thinking about having me as a child, they asked my granddad on my dad's side and said, what should we name this child? And he said, if it's going to be a girl, name her Fatima. But if it's going to be a boy, name him Yunus. So my older sister was eventually born first, and she was named Fatima. And then later I came along and they named me Yunus. So this is part of this prophetic legacy, this interest in these Quranic stories that have inspired and fascinated people throughout time and space. And I also talk about my personal interest in the Islamic Mary. So I grew up in a family with a lot of daughters. I have 3 sisters. Now I have 3 daughters myself, no sons. And this question of women in my life, whether that be my mother, who founded our local mosque and place of worship, and also the role of women as teachers, as leaders, as people who are dedicated to building institutions. What is their role within religion and within society at large? So growing up as now a father and having 3 daughters myself, these questions are always on my mind. How can I create an identity for my daughters, a structure where they help find themselves, but at the same time share with them values that I feel are important, whether that's regarding religion, spirituality, social justice. So how do we transmit the values to the next generation? And how does scripture and religion play an important role in that? So that was the first podcast. And once again, if you haven't listened to it, I would encourage you to go back and kind of hear the origin story of my work on the Islamic Mary and this podcast. So number 2 was Asma of Sarin. So this was an interview I did early on. And one of the things I love about podcasting and the medium itself is that you get the opportunity to interview people and talk to them. So if I was simply a professor and I called up people and say, hey, would you like to talk to me about your book? Some people, they would say yes, and others may say no. But podcasting is a great way to interview and ask those questions you've always wanted to ask. At the same time, other people get to listen in and hopefully benefit. So Asma of Sarin is someone I've been following for a long time. And when I was writing the book, The Islamic Mary, her book, the Oxford Handbook on Women, was something I looked at extensively. I read several of the chapters, and I was super fascinated with her chapter on Quran and women. So this has been a topic, especially the last 20 years, late 90s, mid 90s to after 9/11 to current topics about what is the role of women in the Quran, and is the Quran a gender egalitarian text, or does it endorse patriarchy and misogyny? So this is a perennial question. And one of the things I loved with that interview of Asma of Sarin was talking about her role as the editor. So there was over 25 different chapters in that book. She took years talking and coordinating with other people. An edited volume isn't simply a monograph. So a monograph, you get to wake up in the morning, you focus on your writing, putting your words on the paper. And in some ways that's easier than like an edited volume where you have to coordinate with all these different people. And in the process, you're building a community. These are a group of people that have similar points of view, perspectives, and every edited volume is different because it has different authors and contributors, but it also has similar themes. And you can see that definitely within her text. And I loved her voice, like when she spoke, and she really emphasized the idea of the Quran as a gender egalitarian text. There are no verses that she mentioned several times that talk about the inherent superiority of men over women. And I found her work really compelling and my own work on the Islamic Mary. So Maryam is an amazing figure within the Quran. And as we're talking about currently in the chapter of Maryam, that she is someone that is on the same level of Zachariah, Abraham, Moses, and she's mentioned in the list of other prophets. So whether you understand her as a prophet or not, her spiritual level is ranked similar to those important and pioneering figures. As we discussed, there's a chapter named after her. As well in the Quran, there are other chapters named after prophetic figures, whether that's Abraham, Yusuf, Joseph, and so forth. So that was our number 2 top listened podcast. So number 3 was Fruit of the Spirit by Jordan Denary Duffner. So one of the things I'm intentional about when podcasting and doing my research and writing is to interview scholars from different backgrounds. So Asma of Sarin is a Muslim. She's a senior scholar, written many books, and is a chair now of her department, where Jordan Denary Duffner just finished her dissertation. So I want to reach out to younger scholars and see how they're thinking about issues of Christian-Muslim relations, of Islamic studies. So one of the things I loved about that episode was Jordan's perspective and the future of Christian-Muslim relations. So when I was writing the book on the Islamic Mary, there's this whole discussion of Nostra Aetate and how Nostra Aetate is this amazing document, Vatican II, and so many scholars I read really emphasize how this document is unique, and it emphasizes this great relationship between Christians and Muslims. It mentions Abraham and Mary. But Jordan is the next generation, and she's saying, hey, what about the Prophet Muhammad? That's not explicitly mentioned in Nostra Aetate. How can we understand the Prophet Muhammad as Christians, right? So she's speaking from a Christian voice. And you can also see this emphasis on social justice. And the next generation of Christian Muslim scholars don't want to just talk about Christian Muslim relations or theology or text, but they're really interested in how is this all applicable to our modern world? How is this applicable to what's going on in Israel and Palestine? How is this applicable to Christian Muslim relations in the Middle East? How about here in the United States with Islamophobia, right? So I really liked hearing her voice and how she's thinking about current issues and challenges and how our work is relevant to specific struggles and challenges. So number 4 was Maryam's daughter. So this is an early podcast also I did. And I talked about in this podcast how Maryam is someone in her own right, a protagonist. And Maryam is this amazing figure because she doesn't just come as the mother of Jesus, right? So a lot of us, whether in Christian or Muslim circles, we often see Maryam as the mother of Jesus or of Isa. But what's essential here in the Quran is that the Quran actually introduces Maryam as a daughter first and talks about this emotional story where the mother of Maryam is actually pregnant with her and wants to devote what's in her stomach to the temple. But she gives birth and sees as a daughter. Her hopes and dreams are challenged. How am I supposed to have this daughter at the same time serve the temple? And the divine voice mentions that the female is not like the male and that her name is going to be Maryam and she's going to be chosen and special. So this is really fascinating and important because the Quran talks about daughters. And so someone, myself, who has daughters, I'm really fascinated and always drawn to these discussions. So there are several verses in the Quran that speak about female infanticide and speak about the idea of pre-Islamic Arabs bearing their daughters alive. And they had this disappointment, right? This disappointment that I gave birth to a daughter and I don't have a son, right? In this patriarchal, tribalistic society, your sons represent you. They go to war. They're merchants. They're business people. And a daughter doesn't bring the same prestige as maybe a son does. And that arguably is still present in modern times where people preferring sons over daughters, and also in certain places of the world restricting the number of kids you can have and leading to different attempts to try to have a son. So this was an important aspect because many prophetic figures within the Quran, within the Bible, they often talk about the origins, right? How did they come up? How did they grow up, right? You see this in the story of Joseph, for example, of Yusuf, that he grows up and there's this really fascinating, emotional dialogue with his father, talking about his dream and where he will go in the future, right? So we find the same with Maryam, that before she's actually born, there's this dialogue between her mother and God about her origins. So that was number 4, right? This idea of Maryam as daughter, as a protagonist in her own right. She's not simply subservient to any figure such as Jesus, Isa, but she has her own narrative and she also has her own voice. And lastly, number 5 was redeeming Zachariah. This was an interview I had with Professor Maria, and Professor Maria mentioned her article on redeeming Zachariah. So she is a Catholic scholar. She teaches within seminaries, but she engages the Quran. And this is something I've always tried to encourage professors and educators of the Bible, that incorporate the Quranic text within your teaching and your pedagogy around the Bible. It's important that people understand that the Quran also talks about biblical figures, that there isn't this strict separation, and that the Quran in many ways develops these stories. So in her podcast, Redeeming Zachariah, she talks about how Zachariah historically has been seen in negative light. But when we look at the Quranic narrative, he's seen as someone who's positive. He has this emotional plea. He talks about how his bones are weak, his hair is white. And he doesn't want to leave this earth without any legacy, anyone not represent him. So after this emotional plea, God responds to his call, and then he asks why, and then he's told to be silent as a sign. So he's not seen, this questioning that he has isn't seen as a lack of faith. And as we discussed in other podcast episodes, there is this idea in the Quran of divine questioning. Maryam asks, how is this possible that I'm going to have a child when no man has touched me? And we also see this with Abraham, where he has this question about life and death, and then he asks God, can you resurrect? And then God says, how don't you believe? And he responds and he said, yes, I do, but I want to have tranquility within my heart. So this idea of questioning is not seen as negative for Zachariah or Maryam. And she uses that Quranic narrative to argue that there is this biblical history and tradition that also doesn't see Zachariah in a negative light. So it was also really fascinating to listen to her and talk about her connection and relationship with Christians and Muslims. So she started very textual, looking at these texts, and now she's involved in her local communities with interreligious dialogue. So it's really fascinating to see how the text led to the human engagement, where many times often the relationships lead to someone looking more critically about the text. So that was a very popular episode, and I encourage you also to consider listening to it, and if you have already, to share it with others. So in conclusions, we've done over 25 episodes now of the Islamic Mary podcast. I appreciate all your support and being an avid listener. In these 25 episodes, we've done a mixture of different things, of interviewing folks, reflecting on places, conferences I've been to. We've talked about narratives found within the Quran and also the biblical text. And one of the things that's been a theme is the idea of finding things that have been overlooked. So in my work, I've often been drawn to Ibrahim, but Maryam has been overlooked. And how do we give voice to these figures and what they represent within our teaching and within our research? That's a question that dominates my thinking. Also, a lot of the interviews, I think a lot of podcasters and educators often go to works that are well known. So we often go to the bestseller list. We go to things that are really featured within our conferences. But one of the things I've tried to do is to bring out people and research that hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves. So Asma of Sarin's book, for instance, is amazing work, but it's still being discovered, and scholars are still looking into its contributions. Also, Jordan's work, for instance, and her dissertation still hasn't been published, but it still contributes to this idea of how Christians look at the Prophet Muhammad. So part of my interest as an educator is to highlight some of the research that's been going on within our field that is really groundbreaking and is changing the way people think about the Quran and the Bible, about figures such as Maryam, but hasn't been discovered yet, and will hopefully continue to shape our understanding of Maryam, as well as the Quran and Bible as a whole. So thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I will encourage you to subscribe, encourage your friends, students, and colleagues. So as I mentioned, we already have 25 podcasts, a library now of different interviews and sessions. You're welcome to share those, go back to ones you maybe haven't listened to. I would encourage you to text me, also email me, provide any reviews of this podcast. It's always nice to hear when people reach out and talk about how the content is affecting their work, and also speaking about what they're writing or researching. And you're welcome to visit my website and my newsletter that talks about the Islamic Mary. And my newsletter will be updating folks on the forthcoming publication. I've also added a new quiz to the podcast notes on the Islamic Mary, so I encourage all of you to try that quiz. It's 10 questions. See how you do in the quiz. If you don't do well, if you don't pass the first time, you can always take it again. But that quiz is based on the book and my research on Maryam. Thanks once again, and take care.